Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The storm had passed, but the damage it left behind was the kind that takes more than a morning to measure. Ethan Calder stood at the edge of his grandfather's land, his weathered boots sinking slowly into the wet earth, his sharp blue eyes moving slowly across the destruction the Pacific had sent overnight. Broken branches lay scattered across the bluff like fallen soldiers. The fir trees along the gravel lane had bent and twisted in the wind, and several had not survived. The roar of the ocean below was still restless, still angry, as if the storm had not quite finished saying what it came to say. He had arrived at this property 3 weeks ago with nothing but a duffel bag, a dog, and a quiet desperation that he had carried home from 15 years of service in the United States Marine Corps. The old 2-story wooden house on the Oregon bluff had belonged to his grandfather, John Calder, a man Ethan had loved deeply and understood only partially. When the will was read and the property passed to him, Ethan had not felt like an heir. He had felt like a man being handed something fragile, something he was not yet sure he deserved. But he had come, because he had nowhere else to go, and because something in the salt air and the sound of the waves felt like the closest thing to silence his mind had known in years. Max walked beside him that morning, as he always did. The 6-year-old German shepherd moved with quiet grace through the mud and debris, his dark eyes scanning the land with the same careful attention that Ethan gave it. Max had been rescued 2 years prior, pulled from a situation that had left him fearful of loud sounds and sudden movements. In that way, the two of them had found each other at exactly the right moment. Two souls carrying wounds that did not show on the surface. Two beings who had learned, slowly and carefully, to trust again. Max wore no leash on mornings like this. He never needed one. He stayed close, not out of obligation, but out of something that ran much deeper than training. He stayed because Ethan was his person, and that was simply the whole of it. They walked together through the debris field, and Ethan paused when he reached the far western edge of the yard, where the ancient willow tree had stood for as long as anyone could remember. His grandfather had spoken of that tree with reverence, the way old men speak of things that have outlasted their own memories. But the storm had not spared it. The willow lay on its side, its enormous root system torn from the earth, leaving behind a pit so wide and so deep that the morning mist still curled inside it like smoke. Ethan stood at the edge of that pit and felt something move through him, a grief he could not entirely explain, as if the tree had been the last living witness to his grandfather's life, and now even that was gone. He stood there for a long moment, his hands in his coat pockets, the cold Oregon wind pressing against his face. And then Max moved. It was not a casual movement. It was not the loose, curious trot of a dog chasing a scent. It was focused, deliberate. Max dropped his nose to the edge of the pit, and then, before Ethan could speak a word, leaped down into the muddy hollow below. "Max," Ethan called, his voice low and calm. But Max did not look up. He was already digging. His paws moved with urgent, rhythmic intensity, throwing dark mud behind him, his nose pressed deep into the corner of the pit. He whimpered once, sharp and high, and then dug harder. Ethan had seen that behavior before. Not when Max had cornered a rabbit or caught the scent of something small. He had seen that look when something mattered, when Max was trying to tell him something. Ethan climbed down into the pit. The cold hit him immediately, that deep earth cold that lives below the surface where sunlight never reaches. He crouched beside Max, placed a hand gently on his back, and looked at the corner where Max was digging so furiously. At first, he saw only roots and dark soil, but then Max's paw struck something that was not earth, something hard, something hollow.
The sound rang out in the quiet morning like a bell. Ethan went still. He reached down with both hands and began moving the soil himself, carefully at first, then with growing urgency. Layer by layer, the earth gave way, and what emerged from beneath the roots of that fallen willow was a rusted metal hatch, old and heavy, set into a concrete frame that had been buried so long that the roots of the tree had grown around it like a hand, slowly closing over a secret. Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment. Max sat beside him, perfectly still now, his warm flank pressed against Ethan's arm. He looked up at Ethan with those steady, ancient eyes, as if to say, "I found it. The rest is yours."
It took Ethan the better part of an hour to clear the hatch properly, using a sledgehammer and a pry bar from the old barn. The rust fought him. The hinges had seized decades ago, and the concrete around the frame had cracked and settled over time, making the hatch reluctant to move. But Ethan Calder had not spent 15 years in the Marine Corps without learning how to be patient with things that resisted him. When the hatch finally gave way, the sound it made was like a long, exhaled breath, as if something below had been waiting to be heard. He descended a short iron ladder into a Cold War-era fallout shelter, small and concrete, smelling of damp and time. A single shelf ran along one wall, empty. A shortwave radio sat on a wooden desk, its dials frozen in place. And beneath that desk, half hidden in shadow, sat an olive-drab military ammunition box, its latches still closed. Max had followed him down the ladder without hesitation. He stood close as Ethan knelt and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oilskin cloth, was a leather-bound journal. The handwriting on the inside cover was his grandfather's, and seeing it made Ethan's chest tighten in a way he had not anticipated. He sat on the cold concrete floor, Max pressed warm against his side, and he began to read. The early entries were ordinary. Fishing reports, weather observations, notes about the house and the land. But as the pages turned and the years advanced toward 1962 and then 1963, the tone of John Calder's writing shifted. The careful, measured sentences began to carry weight. References appeared to a secret project shared between three men. His grandfather used only initials, D and L, and a fourth man, referred to once as M, and then never again. By the winter of 1963, the journal entries had become something close to confession. Ethan read until the cold made his hands stiff, and still he read. Max rested his head on Ethan's knee, warm and patient and present, the way he always was, and Ethan was grateful for that weight, that small, steady warmth against his leg, because some of what he was reading made him feel very alone. 4 days later, a car appeared on the gravel lane. The woman who stepped out was in her early 30s, practical in her clothing and direct in her gaze. She carried a leather satchel and a yellowed photograph, and she introduced herself as Clara Donovan, a historian. Her grandfather, she explained, had been an engineer named Samuel Donovan, and she had reason to believe that Samuel Donovan had once stood on this very property in partnership with Ethan's grandfather and one other man. She held up the photograph. 3 young men stood before the old wooden house, the Pacific glittering behind them. Ethan recognized his grandfather immediately. The second man had the same careful eyes as Clara, and the third man, broad-shouldered and unsmiling, had a name written in faded pencil on the back of the photograph: William Lang. Together, over the following 2 days, Ethan and Clara matched the initials in the journal to their ancestors, and they began to understand the shape of what had been hidden. There had been a fourth partner, Mateo Reyes, a man whose name appeared only in documents, never in family stories. A man who had, according to a reel-to-reel audio recording they found sealed inside the briefcase they later discovered behind the western wall of the bunker, been betrayed. They found the briefcase because of Max. Ethan had noticed numeric notations in the spring 1963 entries of the journal, sequences his military mind recognized as grid coordinates. He and Clara had worked to triangulate the measurements inside the bunker, and they had determined that the coordinates pointed to a section of the western concrete wall. The wall appeared solid. There was no visible seam, no indication of anything behind it. But Max had walked to that wall and stood before it, nose working, ears forward, and then he had lifted one paw and placed it flat against the surface, as if pointing. Ethan swung the sledgehammer 10 times. On the 10th blow, the wall cracked open into a hollow cavity, and inside, resting on a narrow shelf built into the concrete, was a dark leather briefcase with tarnished brass fittings. The documents inside were devastating in their clarity. Stock certificates, property deeds, Swiss bank account statements. Every item listed a single name, Mateo Reyes. And the audio recording, crackling and aged, carried the voice of a man confessing that William Lang had orchestrated Mateo's destruction, had framed him as a thief, had taken from him not only his wealth, but his name, his reputation, and ultimately his life. That evening, an elderly woman named Elena Reyes knocked on the front door of the old house. She was dignified and quietly sorrowful, in the way of people who have carried grief so long it has become simply a part of how they stand. She explained that she had watched this property for decades, had known something was here, had never had the means to prove it. Mateo Reyes had been her grandfather. Ethan sat across from her at the kitchen table, and he listened to her speak of a man she had never met, but had spent her whole life mourning. Max lay at Elena's feet within minutes of her arrival, resting his chin on her shoe, as if he understood, in the way that dogs sometimes understand, that this woman needed comfort she had not known how to ask for. Elena looked down at the dog and said nothing for a moment. Then she placed one aged hand on his head, very gently, and her eyes filled with tears she did not let fall. The danger came that same night. A sleek black vehicle moved slowly up the gravel lane after dark, and the man who stepped out was Victor Lang, grandson of William, cold-eyed and certain of himself in the manner of men who have never been told no by anyone who mattered. He had 2 men with him. He spoke about the property and its contents as though they already belonged to him. Max was on the porch before Ethan had taken a single step. The German shepherd stood at the edge of the porch steps, perfectly still, ears fully forward, the fur along his spine raised in a ridge from his shoulders to his tail. The growl that came from him was not loud. It was low and continuous and utterly without doubt. It was the sound of a creature that has made a decision and will not be moved from it. One of Victor's men stepped forward. Max did not bark. He launched, silent and fast and precise, front paws striking the man's chest, driving him backward, jaws close enough to his face that the man stopped breathing for a moment. Max held that position, growling low, body coiled, not biting, but making absolutely clear that biting was one decision away. Even Victor Lang went still. After a long moment, Victor straightened his coat and spoke a cold warning about returning with legal authority. Then he got back in his vehicle, but his eyes, as he left, were the eyes of a man who intended to finish what he had started. Ethan called Sheriff Ben Harper that night. When Victor returned 2 nights later with more men and forced entry into the bunker, they found Ethan waiting. He fired a pump-action shotgun loaded with non-lethal rounds into the concrete wall, the impact and the sound enough to scatter two of the men instantly. The third grabbed Clara. Max moved before Ethan could react, clamping onto the man's forearm with trained and measured force, dragging him down to the ground, standing over him, holding him there with a stillness that was more frightening than fury. The deputies arrived within minutes. Victor Lang and his men were taken into custody. The legal proceedings that followed were long, but the outcome was clear. The briefcase contents were verified by 3 independent experts. Mateo Reyes's name was restored. His legacy, the property rights and the financial estate that had been stolen from him in 1963 was transferred in full to his granddaughter. On the morning the paperwork was finalized, Elena Reyes stood in the yard of the old house and wept, not with sorrow, with something older and rarer than sorrow, with the relief of a wound that has finally, after 60 years, been cleaned and closed. Ethan watched her, and he felt something settle in his own chest, something that had been restless and unresolved since the moment he first set foot on this land. He could not stay. He understood that now. The house, the land, the inheritance, all of it was bound up in a history that did not belong to him to keep. He arranged for the property to be sold to a conservation trust, to remain wild and untouched as it had always deserved to be. On his last morning, he walked with Max to the place where the willow had stood. The pit had been filled in by rain and settling earth, but he could still see its outline, the faint depression in the ground where the roots had once held 60 years of secrets. He knelt beside it. Max sat next to him immediately, shoulder warm against Ethan's arm, chin raised slightly, looking at the same patch of ground with those steady, knowing eyes. "Just us now, buddy. Just us." Max turned and looked at him, not with urgency, not with need, simply with presence, calm, complete, unwavering presence, the look of a creature who has chosen you and who will go on choosing you for as long as he has breath. Ethan placed his hand on the back of Max's neck, felt the warmth of him, the steady life of him, and held it there for a moment. Then he stood, picked up his grandfather's journal from where he had set it on the fence post, tucked it under his arm, and walked back to the truck. They drove south along the coast road as the morning opened above the Pacific, the ocean wide and silver on their left, the fir forests deep and green on their right. Max rode with his nose just at the edge of the window, reading the world in the way that dogs do, with patience and pleasure, and no concern at all for what was behind them. Ethan drove without hurry. The road ahead was long and uncertain, and completely, quietly his own. He had come to Oregon to heal. He had not expected the land itself to need healing first. He had not expected a dog to find what 60 years of silence had buried, and he had not expected that in giving away everything he had inherited, he would finally, after all the years and all the miles and all the noise of war that still lived somewhere in the back of his mind, feel something that resembled peace. The ocean glittered beside him, the road ran on ahead, and Max, faithful and warm and entirely present, rested his chin on the edge of the window and let the salt wind move through his fur, and the morning was quiet and it was good. If this story moved something in you today, if it reminded you that loyalty is real, that justice is possible, and that sometimes the truest courage is the kind that asks for nothing in return, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. Please take a moment to subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Every time you subscribe, you tell us that stories like this one matter, that the quiet heroes, the loyal dogs, the men and women who carry more than anyone sees, deserve to be remembered. Hit the subscribe button below, turn on your notifications so you never miss a story, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Because here at Silent Paws and Brave Hearts, we believe that the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us who we are and who we still have the chance to become. We will see you in the next one.